Welcome back to Inside Criminal Minds, the series dedicated to analyzing the actions of an elite FBI team. If you're new to the series, there's a link in the description to catch you up. This episode begins in a desert.
I'm stuck in the middle of the desert!
With, look at that, it's a dismembered body part. Then we arrive at a diner where we see Gideon and Morgan arrive. And interestingly enough, the waitress hits on Gideon, not Morgan. That's got to be a first. But Gideon wastes no time, beelining it straight to a booth with an older gentleman who already ordered a strawberry shake the earlier waitress drops off, when the gentleman asks Gideon for his name, after which he describes the meaning of Gideon's name. He is both a healer and a warrior from the Bible, meaning his parents basically nailed it from everything we've seen him accomplish thus far. Also an interesting scene from season 1.
You know, Haley and I were looking at a baby names book. Guess what Gideon means in Hebrew?
Mighty warrior.
Appropriate.
Which is interesting that something that far in the past fits along with this episode. Then he introduces himself as Frank, also giving its history. Then Morgan interrupts, forcing Gideon's hand to reveal himself as an FBI agent. And Gideon lays out a profile on Frank that is extremely accurate, down to the clothes that he's wearing and even a notebook in his right pocket that Morgan liberates from Frank, to only find 2 entries.
Well, I can't figure out just 2.
This is interesting, a woman and a portly man, but that'll become a little bit more interesting later in the episode. Next, Frank gives an ultimatum that once he finishes his shake, he will get up and leave the diner to continue his wrath.
That would be a magic trick.
This, however, doesn't sit well with Morgan and also the town police.
That bastards and give her back to us. Next 15 minutes we go in. Agreed? Agreed! Agreed! Agreed!
Also, Morgan notices Frank's fascination with the clock, meaning Frank needs to wait out this situation just a little bit to put his plan into action. This is when they flash back to the FBI HQ, with them discussing the limb in the desert, and is able to link this unsub to a stack of unsolved murders going back almost 30 years. And the only reason they even have this is due to the fact that the unsub messed up royally by dumping 2 bodies at the same time, connected only by a missing rib bone, making him
Most prolific serial killer ever.
Next, Morgan, Hotch, and Gideon arrive at the dump site where cops from towns over are eager to see until they get there and they are brought back to Earth real quick. In true Gideon fashion, he skips the pleasantries and immediately goes to work, forcing Hotch to introduce everybody, and Morgan tries to convince the main cop that there is a serial killer in the area. Then Reed and Prentice arrive at the police station. They are met with slight hostility because of the fact that they're feds. As they're about to settle in, they see a woman freaking out by the name of Jane, but she can't be that important, although she does warn Prentice and Reed about someone coming. This is when she drops something and Prentice returns it, and it turns out to be a whistle. Odd, but she is an odd person. At the dump site, they realize the unsub cauterized the main arteries in order to prolong the death, which shows just how sadistic this unsub is. Morgan sends the pictures to Garcia in order to ID the gangster using his tattoos. And since they don't need a media liaison, JJ is helping the team by plotting all of the known victims on a map in Garcia's office. And this continues her aversion to people messing up her area from when Gideon was left behind due to an injury a couple episodes ago. Meanwhile, Garcia finds out who the gang member was, and there is no link to this victim and the other one other than just the highway nearby. Now, back in the present, Morgan asks some questions to the waitress before she leaves. Then Frank and Gideon play some more mind games with each other.
You don't care about her. You've only ever cared about catching me. It isn't the victims that drive you, Jason. It's the hunt.
Which Frank, I hate to say this to you, but you're not a profiler. Gideon in his office has pictures of the saved victims showing how much reverence he gives to these people who go through traumatic events. And in a future episode, we learn that he has a book with all of his victims in it to remind him why he's doing what he's doing. So, Frank, you called it wrong, buddy. Back to the flashback. In Garcia's Cove, they try to link the victims together, but the only thing that they can piece together is the fact that he uses ketamine in order to subdue his victims. Then the team reveal the profile not only of Frank, but also his vehicle. At the diner, Gideon uses his profiling skills in order to shake up Frank, and it kind of works, but ultimately Frank is still itching to find out how the FBI is sitting in front of him right now. Flashback to the profile, and they decide to set up roadblocks to try and find Frank's workshop on wheels. When one of the cops stops Gideon because the profile reminded her of someone, oh no, it's Crazy Jane, who ends up sharing her story with Prentice, Reed, and Gideon of how she was abducted by an alien and how she was so at ease even after he began to work on her. She was able to see herself and strange maps that turn out to be medical diagrams, and due to her not being afraid, the alien, or Frank, let her go. She was the only one he did let go, and luckily for him, she became a town pariah due to her crazy story of aliens abducting her. At the diner, Frank describes a woman in New York that died and no one noticed for over a year, even with millions of people around. This story doesn't mean anything right now, but it will in a future episode. But this was also a way to get under Gideon's skin. Then Gideon talks to Frank about the change in MO over somebody that he's kidnapped when the husband of that woman busts in with a shotgun to get some answers. And Morgan does a great job of subduing this person. Then,
But you know what's an even more interesting question? What's the psychopath got in the bag, Jason?
that would garner my attention too. This is when Gideon diffuses the situation and simultaneously finds out what's in the bag.
What's in the
Bag.
What's in the fucking
Bag. Turns out to be nothing of importance. It is not the woman he kidnapped. Then Gideon continues the story as the team comb through RV parks in search of Frank's killer mobile. Then, after pounding the pavement and realizing he vacations in this town, Reed and Prentice figure out that the Unsub could be using something like a trailer instead of an actual RV. Then, towards the end of the day, Gideon tells the police chief to change tactics. However, she wants her men to get some rest, but Gideon is not keen on this, so he decides to work through the night with his new plan, with just the BAU. Back at the FBI HQ, JJ is confused that someone saw the RV leaving the town, even though no one got through the roadblocks, and when Garcia traces the number, it belongs to one of the first victims. The chief makes it back home with Jane when Frank arrives and subdues the chief in order to chase after Jane, but Frank wasn't able to catch her, so he kidnaps the chief instead, who just so happens to be the person that is married to the guy in the diner, which does explain the gusto and the shotgun. At the diner, Morgan laments on finding what they missed, with Frank egging him on. They continue the story at the chief's house, where they discuss what happened when Reed finds the needle that sealed the chief's fate. Also, they realize that the prize wasn't the chief, it was Jane, and when Jane escaped, he had to settle for the chief. Just then, the cell phone comes back on, and Garcia tracks it to the diner, splitting the team up. Morgan and Gideon at the diner, and the rest looking for Jane. At the diner, they find Frank's vehicle. At Jane's house, they realize that the wind chimes were made of human bone, meaning that whistle Jane has is probably rib bone. Well, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit, because the wind chimes are one thing, but a whistle that's something that is designed to put in your mouth, that's beyond disgusting. At the diner, the other officer gives Gideon 15 minutes to get the location of the chief, and now we're at full circle. We have caught up to the beginning of this episode. Meanwhile, Reed, Prentice, and Hodge profile the house and collect the wind chimes, and even though this is a serious episode, Reed always finds a way to make people laugh.
I'll define love.
Chemically, it involves surging brain elements called monoamines, dopamines, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Love chemicals controlled by phenolphthaleamine, also found in
chocolate. I love chocolate.
Peas, too. It's also found in peas.
Peas?
Reed.
Indeed. Something
Reed.
will become veritable love.
Stop, please.
I also love how Hotch has to get Reed back on track. Then Hotch notices a barn just big enough to hide a trailer, and when they enter, they find everything the profile, along with one dead body, which is a woman, like one of the ones from the Notebook. Good attention to detail, by the way. But they also find the chief, who's barely hanging on to life. At the diner, Frank is now done with his milkshake, forcing Gideon to be a little bit more aggressive, even after Hotchner calls to confirm the chief is still alive. And Frank reveals something else about Jane that saved her life. She said that he had the most beautiful eyes. This is when Gideon realizes the chief was just a decoy, because Frank would need a lot more to walk away with Jane. As the police storm in the diner, every phone begins to go off.
Magic time.
Next, the chief reveals to her husband that Frank killed a teacher and there's an abandoned bus and a bunch of school children missing. This was Frank's endgame in order to leave scot-free. It's also interesting that the other person in the Notebook was a male who was portly, most likely referencing the bus driver. This is when Frank shows all his cards, and unfortunately, they're pretty good ones. Next, Jane arrives in a police cruiser. Then Hotch, Prentice, and Reed attempt to explain how this guy is, and I'm not quite sure she gets what's going on. Gideon leads the prisoner exchange. Frank also admits that he will never kill again as long as he has Jane, which even Gideon knows is a lie. Finally, Frank agrees to let Gideon drive to find the kids. During the drive, Frank gets all mushy with Jane, and it's very unsettling. Frank stops the car 2 miles away from the kids in order for Frank to make a getaway. My skin always crawls hearing Frank and Jane talk about love, but they get away and Gideon finds the abandoned children safe and sound, ending this episode a little bit bittersweet. They do find the children, but at what cost? This episode introduces one of the most prolific serial killers we have seen, and honestly, I don't find his motives very interesting. He can't feel fear, so he puts people in situations in order to see fear. I just don't buy it. But his methods are the craziest we've seen so far in this series, even counting the Fisher King. This is also the first episode where they don't catch the Unsub, and even in the next episode, they don't catch him, which is not typical with the two-parters that are in this series. Oddly enough, I do like Jane as a character. Going through trauma would send someone into a disassociative break, and it's interesting that she uses this as a coping skill, and using her state of confusion, she pulls what she could potentially have in her head, which was aliens, and the twist end that Frank had a bus full of kids somewhere in the desert was set up in such a way that unless you previously saw this episode, you would never see it coming, which really elevates this episode to one of the better ones in this season. Also, this episode did a good job of humanizing Gideon and profiling him as much as the team profiled Frank. Thanks for watching. If you're curious on how a spy operates after losing his job, check out Burn Notice, my other series. Link in the description. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.